The NES game Excitebike is all about the jumps and about using your rear tire to dumpster the AI players, but mostly the jumps. In addition to being like just kind of cool, the jumps are cool, the purpose of these jumps is to impact the player's speed. So the player has to orient the angle of their bike to match the angle of the surface that they're landing on when they come down from a jump. This is a mechanic that I didn't notice when I had originally played the game, like way back in the day, but when I replayed it in modern times, I thought this would be a cool thing upon which to build a Pico-8 prototype. So build I did, and if you want to see how that initial version came together, I made a video about it, and you can check it out. The link is in the description, and probably somewhere on the screen if I remembered to put the card in. Since that initial version, I've continued to iterate on that prototype, and I thought it was a nice time for an update. So I want to talk a little bit about how we went from this version to this version. Let's get the most obvious thing out of the way first. So clearly I spent a little bit of time improving the graphics on this title. Historically, I don't invest all that much time in the visuals on my prototypes, but recently I've started, well, not recently, like since a long time ago, I felt this way. Like I felt that my pixel art skills need to be better. I need to do a little bit more. It's sort of been a weak point of mine, and so I've been practicing a little bit, just a little bit, in between these videos. So anyway, the first thing I did was to replace the sprite of the snowboarder guy. So this was our original character. We are going to bid farewell to our tiny green jumpsuited creature here. We hardly knew ye, friend. We hardly knew ye. That original character has been replaced by this much chonkier orange jumpsuited character. I went with orange because I figured it would pop nicely against the white snowy background. But also, I guess mostly because my own snowboard coat is orange, like in real life. So I guess that was in my brain. My skin is not blue, but my snowboard coat is orange. I also went through a series of iterations on the visuals for the track itself. So the previous version was just that blue line on the screen, and it was sort of drawing these blue line segments. You can see here, I just swapped in the new sprite, changed the background color, and kept the blue line for a bit. And here was sort of a midway through version where I replaced the flat surfaces, but not the ramps yet. The ramps were a little bit harder to get the graphics right. You can also see some early attempts at the parallax scrolling that I'll get into in a little bit. And finally, here's the version of the game as it exists today. You can see that not only are there some kind of graphics for the flat part, but there's also some kind of graphics for the ramps themselves. You may also see that the sort of lower segment of the ramp doesn't quite line up perfectly with the sort of, curvy fringe that I made for the flat segments. I'm kind of okay with that right now. Like maybe I'll put in some sort of hack later so that they align perfectly, but honestly, it's not bothering me enough to spend a lot of time on it right now. And then finally, in the background there, you can see there's some nice snow-covered pine trees. I tried to be conscious of my color choices and how messy I made that background so that, I didn't want the player to kind of get lost in the noise of those trees there. I also put in some parallax scrolling, so if you can kind of see, behind the trees, there's that gray line of, I don't know, they could be hills, they could be trees, use your imagination. But you'll notice when I restart this, that backmost gray background layer will be scrolling more slowly than the trees. Here we go. See that? Look at that. Pretty neat, huh? I know parallax scrolling in 2D games is a little bit of a cliche, but I like it a lot, so I wanted to add it. And also it's interesting how you go about implementing it, and it's not as hard as you might think. So let's dig into how we can implement parallax scroll on Pico-8 a little bit for our little live demo segment for this episode. Before we get to parallax, let's talk a little bit about just regular old infinite scrolling. So normally, if your character is moving from left to right, you've probably got some ground floor tile Like on the screen here, I've got this nice like grass, I guess, texture or grass tile. And like in a normal game, if your character's moving, you kind of just want to repeat this forever as it scrolls. So you can kind of see if I walk to the right here, it's scrolling forever. I'll explain the color differential in a minute. But in any case, the way you actually want to implement this is you're going to have one copy of your background that is stretched across the whole screen, right? In Pico-8, we've got 128 pixels. So we're going to just take this ground tile and copy it so it's 128 pixels wide. Now the problem with that is when the player walks to the right, that's going to be the end of the 128 pixels. That's where that seam is. That's why I've got two different colors there. So what we would normally do is just create another copy of the same background at 128, x equal 128, and we'll scroll that by. So I've made a darker color green here so you can sort of see where the seam is, but normally this would all be just the same color or the same tile. Then what happens is as this first chunk, our light green background copy, reaches the left edge of the screen, we're gonna remove it and copy it back to the other side. So it's gonna be to the right of this dark green one, so that when we continue to move forward, oh, there it is again. Same thing, when the dark green one reaches the leftmost edge, it's going to jump over there, right? So this is a little bit easier to see if we change the width of the sort of viewport. So notice I put this nice big pink rectangle around the screen here. This is the full width of Pico-8's screen. So normally we do want to use all 128 pixels. But what happens if we make this like, instead of 128 by 128, if we change it to 64 by 64, we'll actually be able to see what's happening with each of the chunks of background. Give me a minute and let me change the configuration. Okay, now we're gonna pretend here that we only have 64 pixels instead of 128 to work with. So now you can actually see, you are a god in this realm, and you can see beyond what the player can see. So you can see here, we've got 64 pixels worth of light green background and 64 pixels of dark green hiding off screen. So when the player begins to walk and it scrolls, you'll see that slowly our light green background is exiting the screen, and currently to the right of the dark green, there's nothing. Right? So it's a void, it's empty space. But if we scroll far enough, our light green background will realize that it's gone too far and it'll copy itself back to the right side of the screen. Here we go. Bam, there we go, ready to go. So the player doesn't even see this. Again, this takes place outside of the magical pink box. So the player is not gonna notice any of this stuff, but we can just keep doing this over and over again. And to the player, this just looks like an infinitely scrolling patch of grass, even though we're basically just like flip-flopping these two background chunks over and over again. Code-wise, you can see here are our two copies of the background. And I've given them an X position, which we're updating every frame, along with a DX, which is just their velocity. So let's look at how the velocity updates the X. Here we can see as the player moves to the right, they're moving one pixel at a time, and the background is currently in sync, or both copies of the background are in sync. So remember we set our DX to be 1, so background 1, that first light green chunk, is moving at 1 pixel every time the player moves 1 pixel. And our other chunk, the dark green chunk, is moving at the exact same speed. These if statements are just the logic that makes the background chunk copy itself back to the right-hand side of the screen as it scrolls away. So that's the infinite scrolling part, but we started off our discussion by wanting to talk about parallax. And we can't do parallax with only one background layer. So let's add in another background layer. Let's add some mountains. We've got grass, we need some mountains, right? That's the next logical thing, or flowers, but I drew mountains, so we're gonna do that. There you go. Hope you like those mountains. I used the same technique of just giving one copy of the mountains a different color so you can sort of see where the seam is, and I've given them the same velocity. Oops, no I didn't. I did not at all. I did not do jack. Okay, we're back. So as we scroll, you can see that the mountains and the grass and the player are all scrolling in unison, and they are both copied to the right-hand side of the screen when there's that sort of scroll past thing happening. So this will just go on forever. But this is also not parallax, right? Because what we want is to give the illusion of depth by having the mountains move more slowly than the grass. So again, we'll go back up to the top and we've got our 2 copies of the grass background. And then I've defined 2 more tables here for the 2 copies of the mountains. And so far, they're identical, right? They have the same starting X positions as the grass background, and they have the same DX. And this is where we make the parallax magic happen. Since they're moving at the same speed, but we want them to move more slowly, we'll just update this value here. So we'll change it to 0.5. That should be significant enough of a difference in velocity that it will look like they're moving much more slowly, thus tricking your brain into thinking that they're farther away. We shall reload Pico-8 and walk to the right, and yeah, there you go. Hopefully that comes across on video. You can see that they're shaking a little bit as they update the position, but for the most part, that looks parallaxy. If we want to get like a slightly less janky looking version, we can probably set the screen width back to full width. Hang on a sec. All right, let's see how this looks. There you go. See, now you don't have to worry about all the extra visual noise of the copying happening. But yeah, if you were to make both the mountains and the grass to be the same color again, it would just look like an infinitely scrolling parallax background. Going back to our other blue-skinned buddy here, you can see, hopefully, that the pine trees, the pine trees are only one layer, but that layer of pine trees, and then that layer of whatever, the gray in the background, will scroll at different rates once we start going. So you can see the pine trees are going faster, thus giving the gray stuff this sense that whatever it is, that gray mass is in the back somewhere. By the way, I figured out how to do this by reading an article from a site called Doc Robs. I will be sure to link that in the description. Let's now have a look at the changes to the level parser. So last time we looked at how to build levels, I introduced this big old struct that you're looking at on screen right now. It's got each line segment with a start and end coordinate, and this F, which defines some linear function that will tell Pico-8 how to draw the course on the screen. If you want to know the details of that, I encourage you to check out the last video for this slice. I will link to it somehow on the screen. Anyway, this level format was entirely functional, by which I mean it worked fine. It was fine. But it had a couple of flaws. As you can probably see, this uses a lot of tokens, right? And the tokens are repetitive because, again, we're sort of doing the same thing for each segment. This F part especially, we're just repeating the same function body over and over and over again. So what this would mean is if I wanted to do lots of levels or particularly long levels, I would just run out of tokens really quickly because I'm using these like reified method calls for each line segment. The second flaw that I had was that there was no information that would allow me to encode like elevation changes. So let's look at the old version of the game real quick. Here we go. So you can see I'm at a Y value of, I guess, 64, or that blue flat line is at, I think, 72. And I've got these ramps, but you'll notice that like after I go over the ramp, I wind up back at Y equals 64 again. Right? I'm not like just going up a ramp to like a new plateau. I'm always returning to the same flat part. And this bothered me. I didn't want to do this. I thought it would be more exciting if we could change the elevation of the flat part, because you can go up a little bit, you can go down a lot, etc. I thought that'd be cool. So I wanted to write that bit into the new parser. I wrote a new format for the level that is not terribly dissimilar for what I wrote for the Kung Fu slice in the last series. I mean, format-wise, it's very different, but the idea is similar. I kept the idea of using linear functions to draw the map, to draw lines on the map. And if you look at this new version here, you can see that even though I've sort of wrapped it in some slightly nicer looking snow graphics, those lines are still there, right? They look a lot like the original version of this. The basic format for my string-based levels is, it's got 3 chunks. The first chunk is the segment type, which could be like flat or up for the up part of the ramp or down for the down part of the ramp. The length of that segment. And then the third part is just an extra bit of information. So some segments need some extra info. For example, if I wanted a flat segment that was 64 pixels long at elevation 72, I would write flat, comma, 64, comma, 72. That's this initial part here. And then if I wanted a long downward slope, I would write d down 128, which means I want a downward slope with a length of 128, and there's no extra information for this part needed. Now, of course, after this long downward slope, we've got another flat part. That flat part is now defined as flat 128, that's 128 pixels long, at elevation 200. And again, remember Pico-8, as you move down, the Y value increases. So we went from 72 to 200. And so on and so forth. So we just keep like adding segments this way. The original sort of linear functions that draw those lines still totally exist, but rather than repeating those functions like over and over again and using all those tokens, I'm just referencing them. Like I'm basically just passing around pointers to the functions. So each segment knows which function it has to call, and that function is only defined once. In terms of gameplay changes, I made two that were kind of significant, I think, and hopefully are building this into something that will be a little bit more fun to play. The first was to reduce the number of possible board angles. So in the prototype, the last version, I had 7 angles, right? Here's our neutral angle, and we've got 1, 2, 3 going back, and 1, 2, 3 moving forward. So this is cool, and I love the sort of nuance of each slightly different angle and having to manipulate that. However, what I was bumping up against is that it would be very tricky visually for the player to know, like to figure out quickly what angle their board was at, as well as what angle the oncoming ground was going to be, right? They have to make these decisions really quickly, and without memorizing it, it didn't seem realistic. I thought of different ways of communicating this visually. For example, I thought maybe putting a number that indicated the angle next to the player, and then also putting numbers on the ground, like putting numbers actually near the ground would be, the flat ground would be 0, and then the upward ramp here would be, I think, -2, the downward ramp would be +2, etc. Visually, that felt quite noisy, so I got rid of that. I also considered using colors, like different colors would be different angles, but I'm aware that using colors for gameplay elements like that can be like not great for accessibility, so I abandoned that idea as well. Finally, I settled on just simplifying the whole darn thing down to just 3 angles, right? So we got neutral, we got back, and we got forward, and that's it. So that should be simple enough, few enough states that the players should be able to recognize at a glance like what angle their character is at and what angle they need to align to for the ground. Now, only 3 angles maybe is like not enough. That's a concern I still have. Like maybe that's almost too simplistic, but I'm going to start simple and we'll add the complexity later rather than starting from complexity and winding up with an unplayable mess of a game. The second change is I added a boost. So I wanted to give the player some small reward for positioning their board correctly when they land. So I opted to give them a brief speed boost. Visually, this is indicated by the board flashing colors. So let me just do it here so you can see. There you go. Okay, so the board is flashing. So to describe what's going on in code, the player has some property, dx max, which is their maximum speed in the x direction. And by default, that's 1.5. So if we have a look at the game real quick, you'll see very quickly the player reaches dx of 1.5 and they're not accelerating past that, right? They speed up to that point and then they stop and they don't go any faster. However, if we successfully land from a jump, we update that value to be 2.8 and we set a timer to run in the background. So you can see if we land this, that dx max in the bottom of the screen should go to 2.8. Right, and then you can see the player's dx value right above the dx max is slowly, actually relatively rapidly, increasing. Now, when that timer that we set expires, we just reset the player's max dx to 1.5. So currently, this is a pretty hard stop. So you can see it here. We just like screw this up. We'll get it once and then not again. And there you go. You can see like the DX max just changed back to 1.5. That happens in a single frame. And so if you're going super fast and then the timer goes off, you basically go from 2.8 to 1.5 in a single frame, and that can be a little bit jarring. So I may smooth it out later, but right now I think it's not so bad. So as an initial pass, I think this is okay. I feel like this is almost something now. In particular, I feel like the boost might lead to some interesting possibilities for level design, since you'll land in different locations based on whether or not you're boosting. So effectively, your path through the level is going to differ based on how well you're doing. I'll keep working on this, and I'll post another update when I have something significant to share. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope the parallax stuff was educational. Until next time, I have been Eric. Thank you for your time and attention. I appreciate you, and bye for now.